Hello and welcome to this chess tips video. This is the third part in this 3 video series on how to improve your chess. So each video I came up with 15 different tips that will help you improve your chess. So basically I went online and kind of looked at all the different recommendations that I could find on the internet. And I tried to compile about 45 of them so I could put 15 in each video. So today I have 15 more tips on how to improve your chess. And while we go over those, I'll play a game here which was played with Magnus Carlsen having the white pieces versus Andrei Gorovets with the black pieces. So Magnus Carlsen starts off with A4. So right away the computer doesn't like that and says that's an inaccuracy, that E4 would have been better. Okay, so these 15 tips to help you improve your chess. The first one is stay with one opening for a long time. Now why might that be a good tip? Unless you're Magnus Carlsen and maybe he gets bored of playing the same openings and he just experiments with all different kinds of openings. And of course, he's so good that he can play these crazy openings and follow them up with so many really good moves that he usually wins most of his games. So for us average chess players, you want to basically pick an opening move with white and then just decide on how you follow it up depending on what your opponent does. And then the same with black. You just pick what response you'll play depending on what white plays. So if he plays E4, maybe you want to play E5 or C6, the Caro-Kann, whatever. So here we have Magnus Carlsen playing A4 and his opponent responds with G6. So maybe he decided, well, I don't know what Magnus is doing, so I'll try and steer into this kingside fianchetto opening, which could be kind of like a King's Indian defense or a modern opening. It just depends on how black follows up and what white does. All right, so tip number 2 is avoid trades that help the opponent develop. So let's look at some further moves in this game. Now Magnus takes control of the center with E4. And also this E4 move, if black plays E5, then it'll block in his bishop. So black doesn't do that, plays a kind of Sicilian defense with C5 here. And Magnus plays H4, which, is, the computer says it's an inaccuracy, but a lot of times when you have a fianchettoed position, you might want to play H5 here and try and attack that defensive pawn structure here. All right, so Magnus's opponent develops knight to F6 here, and now Magnus brings his knight out. So both sides are just developing. And now this second tip that said the first one was stay with one opening for a long time, until you get all the intricacies of that opening down. You get down, the middle game plans and the pawn structures, and you figure out where to put your pieces, and you become familiar with that opening. So that's why you want to stay with an opening for a while before you switch to something else. And also, in this second tip, avoid trades that help the opponent. Well, here, if we go back, we have this move attacking the knight, and then black responds with this move. So let's say instead, um, well, even with this move involved as well, if instead a6 was played, well, this says avoid trades that help the opponent develop. If the bishop captured the knight, well, this pawn would be developed, towards the center. It would also open up a line for the bishop to develop. But usually they mean something like if you have this bishop pinning the knight and then you capture it and it helps the queen recapture and develop, that's kind of what you want to watch out for. So in the game we have this attack, which is trying to get rid of Magnus's bishop pair. So how does he respond? He just develops this knight. And so here's an example of what I was talking about. Normally, you don't want to capture this knight here with your knight in the center. So you have this great knight sitting in the center. It's on your opponent's side of the board, attacking a lot of squares. And it's under attack by this knight. So, what do you do here? Well, one thing you probably don't want to do is just capture, because then that just helps this queen develop. And so you've lost your nice knight in the center. Now white's lost this knight, but as you capture his knight, it helps him develop his queen. So that's kind of what I mean by avoid trades that help your opponent develop. So let's see what happened next in the game. The opponent just develops here, getting ready to castle. Now this bishop is aiming down the center of the board towards the queen side, and Magnus responds with an attack here, attacking the knight. And how does the opponent respond? Well, the knight moves out of the way and puts pressure on this pawn with the bishop. But of course, at the moment, the knight is protecting. And so what will Magnus do? Because this knight could be captured here and then the pawn could be captured. So Magnus ignores that and just pushes this pawn so he can develop his other bishop. And so now instead of capturing and then if Magnus recaptured, the bishop could capture the pawn. We have an attack on the bishop. So the bishop retreats, and now we have this attack on the pawn. All right, so the next thing is, so this is the third tip, avoid pins. So let's see if we have any pins developing in this game. So the knight comes up here. We have an attack on this bishop. The bishop captures the pawn. And now we have an attack. And so we have a pin of this pawn on the rook. And if you want to avoid pins, that might be one reason why this pawn was pushed to attack the bishop. The bishop could still move here, I guess, and keep this pin on the pawn. But let's see what he does. Instead, Magnus backs all the way up, wanting to keep the bishop lined up on the king side here. And so the pawn is finally captured, but now this allows the knight to jump up in the middle here. Well, this bishop didn't really affect the knight jumping forward, but Magnus jumps his knight up into this centralized position with the knight, and his opponent moves here, perhaps to develop his bishop and pin this knight. If the bishop moves to b7 here, it'll pin this knight to the pawn, which is unprotected at the moment. So Magnus attacks the knight retreats, and now the queen jumps up, threatening a checkmate, I believe, right here on f7. So black castles, and the computer says this is a mistake. Instead, just moving down here would have been better to cover that pawn. So Magnus continues the attack, pushing forward and attacking the knight. All right, so anyway, let's get back to these chess tips. So the first one was stay with one opening for a while so you can learn that opening and really figure out, if you like it or not. If you just play it for a short period of time and then switch, you may not have given that opening enough time to make a good decision on whether that opening works for you or not. So number 2 was avoid trades that help your opponent. So you don't want to capture a knight, giving up one of your developed pieces and bringing in the opponent's piece that recaptures and helping him develop. All right, number 3 was avoid pins. So sometimes pins can't be avoided, but if you do get a piece that is in a pin, you want to try and break that pin. So, at the moment, if this knight would move, the queen would be pinning this knight to the rook. So, pins can be very dangerous. Always keep an eye out for them. Number 4 is learn the value of pawn structure. So, let's take a look at this game, at the pawn structure. Well, both sides have done a pretty good job in keeping their pawns together. We only see 2 pawn islands on each side. So pawn structure can be very important because if you don't keep an eye on your pawn structure and prevent weaknesses from developing in the pawn structure, it can lead to long-term endgame problems. So let's say all your pawns are broken apart and spread all over. Well, they're harder to defend if they come under attack. Whereas if they're side by side, they can protect each other. And also, you want to be careful how you push pawns. For example, if this c pawn was pushed up to c4, well, one, it would block the scope of the bishop, but it would create a hole here on d4, because then no pawns would be able to cover this d4 square, and the knight could jump in there attacking the queen, threatening a fork here on c2 of the king and the rook. It could lead to all kinds of problems. So definitely keep an eye on your pawn structure and try not to create any unnecessary weaknesses. Now, sometimes you can't prevent all weaknesses, but keep them to a minimum. All right, so next we have number 5. Don't trade your good pieces for your opponent's bad pieces. And that might be harder for beginners to understand, but the more you play, you understand which pieces are good and which ones are bad. So let's see here. We haven't had much going on in the game. So the knight was under attack and retreats. And so now we have Magnus pushing forward with the attack. So a capture, opening up the king side. And now the knight attacks here. So when it comes to trading good pieces for bad, we haven't really had a lot of trades in this, but let's see how it continues. So the king captures here, but now we have the knight jumping in with check. And what do I mean by trading good pieces for bad ones? Well, if we go back here and look at this position, let's see, we'll go back a little bit further. Let's see. Well, right now, Magnus has these great knights here just aimed at Black's king side. They're doing a great job. Let's see. I don't know. There might not be too many good examples here of where we can trade good pieces for bad. But one way to describe this is some bishops are good bishops and some are bad, and that's determined by if we look at these bishops here. So the light squared bishop is in a good position, but if he was in the center, he could be blocked by this central pawn, which is on the same colored squares that the bishop is on. So Magnus has done a good job of improving this bishop by moving it outside of this central pawn's path. That way, it's not being obstructed by this pawn. So Magnus's good bishop is this dark squared bishop, which can move around this central pawn. And now here's a better example of a bad bishop. It's trapped in by its own central pawn, whereas this good bishop can move around this pawn on the light squares. So you wouldn't want to trade one of your good bishops for a bad bishop, or one of your knights that's well centralized for a less centralized piece that belongs to your opponent. So just keep that in mind. You want your pieces that are placed in better positions where they're doing more, they're covering more squares. You want to try and hold on to those to keep the pressure on your opponent by keeping those pieces on the board, because if you trade them off, one, it reduces your attacking power, but two, if you trade those off for your opponent's weaker piece, then you're kind of giving up an advantage by giving up your good piece for one of their not so good pieces. All right, let's move on to the final tips here. So number 6 is watch out for forks. So let's see how this game continues. The knight retreats and the pawn moves up. We have a trade of pawns and this sacrifice of the knight pulling the king over, and then we have the knight jumping up, continuing to attack. And as the knight retreats here, we have the queen moving over here and capturing this unprotected knight here. So, how did that happen? How long has that been in the works? So if we go back here and look at this, the pawn moves forward. After this capture, now Magnus sacrifices his knight and then jumps over here with a check of the king, and it opens up this line on the knight. So the king retreats and we have a capture. So the game continues with a capture of this pawn, and the rook moves up attacking the queen, and the queen retreats trying to trade off material here. So what does Magnus do? Well, at this point, he just captures a rook now that's unprotected. So we have the rook centralizing, threatening a, looks like a mate threat here. So the bishop moves to cover that square and prevent the mate threat, although the computer recommends bishop to b3 here to cover that. Now we have the pawn capturing here, attacking the rook. So what does Magnus do here? Well, he brings his rook up, attacking the king, and his opponent resigns here. Why? Because the game would continue like this. Because the king is checked and there's nowhere to escape, the king would be forced to capture, and then that would lead to this knight fork here of the king, the rook, and the queen. So that is why it's definitely very important to watch out for forks, because if you let a knight get into your position and you're not keeping an eye on it, there might be many possibilities for some dangerous forks. So always keep an eye on those knights, especially when they move into your side of the board. And hopefully you won't get yourself stuck in a fork like this, which gives up the queen on the next move after this king retreats. All right, so we can see how this would play out. The king would move, and then the queen would be captured, the bishop captures, and then now we have an attack on the rook, which is protecting the bishop. So the rook moves over, castling here, attacking this unprotected bishop, and you get the idea. Magnus would be winning, and in this game it says he played at a 3,000 level versus his 2650 opponent. And it says white really outplayed black in that one. Both white and black missed some chances in the opening. The middle game battle was fairly even. All right, so watch out for forks. The next tip is pawn moves create weaknesses. So definitely watch out for those pawn moves. So let's go back earlier in the game and see if there were any weakening pawn moves. Okay, so one thing we notice here with this pawn move, once you move a pawn, it can never be moved back, of course. And so this pawn can never again cover the b3 square or the b4 square. So those could potentially become weaknesses. I mean, right now you have this bishop covering b3, or excuse me, this pawn covering b3. And if b4 really needed to be covered, the pawn could move to c3 to cover b4. But then there would be another weakness on b3 here if the pawn moves up. So always watch your pawn moves, and before you make those pawn moves, ask yourself, all right, once I move this pawn, am I creating any dangerous weaknesses in my position that my opponent could take advantage of? All right, so now discovered attacks, which we saw a very interesting discovered attack. Where was that? Right here in the game. So a good example of a discovered attack. Always, keep an eye out for discovered attacks. Both discovered attacks you can use on your opponent, and make sure you don't fall into a discovered attack like this. So the queen is lined up on this knight. The knight attacks the king, and the queen is able to just jump over here and grab this knight and then attack the rook as well. So watch out for discovered attacks like that, and especially if they involve the king. All right, the next tip is keep an eye on knight moves. So that kind of ties into the forks that we talked about earlier. Although forks don't have to just involve knights. Queens, rooks, bishops, even pawns can fork pieces as well. But keep an eye on dangerous knight moves. So if we go back here, so Magnus drove this knight back with this pawn. So the knight retreats, and then now we begin these dangerous knight moves. Okay, first the pawn pushes forward, opening things up. After this capture, Magnus jumps in here with this brilliant knight move, kind of luring the king in. What should his opponent do? Well, that's the best move, is to go ahead and capture that knight, even though this other knight move puts you in check, and then you can pick off this knight. So watch out for those dangerous knight moves. Okay, the next tip, number, 10? Anchor bishops to pawns. So a lot of times, and especially in endgames, you can anchor your bishops to the pawns. So they kind of protect each other. The pawn protects your bishop, and the bishop, of course, protects the pawn. And that's, a good end game strategy. I don't know if there were many opportunities for that to happen in this game. We can glance through here again real quick. Okay, here's a good example. So right now, the bishop is anchored to this pawn. Now, here the pawn on a7 can just play to a6 and chase the bishop away. But if this knight wasn't here and the queen moved down to a5, well, the bishop is protected by the pawn and the queen, couldn't really do much. So anchoring a bishop to a pawn is just a good defensive move. It protects the pawn and it keeps the bishop protected as well. Okay, so the next tip is don't give away pawns. So a lot of beginners, think, I don't need these pawns. They just start throwing pawns out there and giving them up and trying to get their pieces in on the action. Well, every pawn could potentially promote and become a queen, if they make it up the board far enough. So be very careful about just giving up pawns. If it's a gambit and you have a good follow-up, there might be a reason to give up pawns, but don't just start giving up all your pawns for no reason. If we look later in the game, let's see if any pawns were given up here. All right, here we have two pawns attacking each other, and Magnus just ignores that pawn because he wants to jump his knight up into the position here. So, I guess the pawn could be captured, but Magnus's opponent, instead of capturing that pawn, which, let's see what is best. Best would have been to castle here and ignore that pawn. So, in the game, we had the attack of the bishop, and here it looks like this pawn could possibly be captured, and so Magnus does capture that pawn. So it looks like his opponent just gave up a pawn when they shouldn't have, but let's see what would have been better. So the best move, is to attack with the knight. Attacking with the knight. Well, that would jump the knight up into a good forward position. Although the knight could be chased away with e6 here. But the moral of this little story here is don't just give away your pawns, because now Magnus is just ahead a pawn. Let's see what happened in the game. All right, so let me go back here. We grab the pawn. The bishop is chased away. Now this pawn is captured. So here we had an even pawn trade. It was just the capture of Magnus's pawn was a little bit delayed. And so now the knight jumps up. And let's see if we have any more unnecessary pawn sacrifices here. All right. So capture. And now here is a good example of giving away a pawn with a good follow-up. So if we go back, Magnus pushes his pawn here and it's captured, but now this has opened up the h-file for the rook, and Magnus follows up with a good sacrifice of that knight, the discovered attack with a capture here, and an attack on that knight. So the king retreats, capture, and now, was that a pawn capture? Yes. So there we have that capture. Anyway, before this drags on too far, just remember you don't want to just go around giving away all your pawns for no good reason. So, remember, pawns can be valuable, especially as they push up the board past pawns, preparing to promote. Okay, number 12, use pawn breaks. So, good example of a pawn break to start this whole attack off. So the pawn pushes here, the king retreats, and a pawn break is when you push a pawn forward to kind of initiate an action, an attack. So here this pawn pushes forward, I guess breaking forward or pressing into the opponent's camp, and there is a confrontation here between these pawns. So the pawn pushes forward and attacks, preparing to open lines to, aid white's pieces in developing and giving them more scope for the attack. And then we have that trade, the sacrifice. So let's see. The pawn breaks, moving forward, attacking, capture, and then it kind of begins the attack here. So, remember, pawns pressing forward, initiating an attack. Always look for opportunities to do that if you can follow it up with some advantage. Don't just go throwing your pawns forward all crazy unless there's a good follow-up afterwards. So here, Magnus allows that pawn to be captured, but it opens up a line. After the knight captures, the king captures. Now this pawn is pinned by the rook. We have a check, and then an attack on the other side of the board. So if we continue further on here, now this capture occurs, but it allows the rook to move up here, forcing the king to capture and then leading to a fork if the game would have played out further. All right, let's see. Number 13 is don't forget about backward piece moves. So a lot of people overlook those moves. Everybody thinks, well, I have to attack. I should be moving forward. So here, everybody's moving their pieces forward in the game. All the pieces are developing, pressing up the board. Like this knight, it was under attack. What does it do? It doesn't retreat, it moves forward. But there are times when backwards moves, a backward move can come in handy. So far, everybody's just pressing forward. Now the bishop is under attack. So, of course it can't move forward, and it backs up here. So if we just keep, playing through the game, now the bishop is forced to back up. Now, sometimes it'll be good to make backwards moves, make a backward move by one of your pieces, even when they're not under attack. Sometimes you have to reposition. So here, the bishop moves forward, and now it's under attack. So here, Magnus is forced to make a backward move by his bishop, but where does he go? Well, if he goes here, it can be captured, of course. Here, that may be a possibility, but Magnus retreats back this way, wanting to keep an eye on the king's side over here. So, just remember that you don't always have to move forward with your pieces. Sometimes it pays to retreat a piece back, maybe to a square where it can reposition forward. So sometimes a knight might have to retreat back so it can move forward to a better or different square that might give you an advantage. So just keep that in mind. All right. Number 44 is use outposts. So we see this knight on d4 on a wonderful outpost on his opponent's side of the board, covering a lot of squares. Magnus has this knight on an outpost here, but the knight could be chased away. So here we have some trades. This pawn jumps forward. Now, generally, an outpost is when you have a square you can move a piece to. Knights do really well on outposts. When you move it to a square where it can't be chased away by a pawn. So this outpost on e4 is not the greatest outpost. It could be chased away by an f5 pawn move, but that would kind of weaken the king side a little bit. So here, after this knight moves up to e4, this pawn could possibly jump here to c3 and chase away this knight out of a good outpost. So as the game goes further, here Magnus does play c3, chasing that knight away from its good outpost. And here it retreats back, keeping the bishop protected. Should he have moved here? Well, if the knight moved here, that would have led to a fork of both knights. So that's why it's better to move here to c6. All right. Any more outpost squares? Let's see. So this knight is chased away from its outpost, although it's not a very good outpost on the edge of the board like that. So he retreats back, and then Magnus, starts the attack, which we've seen here multiple times. Capture, and the knight. And one reason that it's good to have an outpost, especially if it's on your opponent's side of the board, is because you never know when it could lead to an attack. So these knights are in a prime position here to just jump in. Once again, we'll look at this attack, and now it leads to an attack on the other side of the board. So watch out for outposts and try to use them if you can. So today's final tip is when you are up a lot of material, sacrifice into a winning end game. And sometimes you don't even have to sacrifice. So let's take a look at what's happening here. Right now, black is ahead in material, but after the king retreats, now material is even. And then we have some capture of the pawn here. Black is ahead. Queen is under attack. We have the queen retreating. But material is about even. If we traded queens here, well then, this pawn could capture, evening the material. But, why do that? Magnus can just pick off a rook here. So capture. And interestingly enough, the computer recommends queen to e4 instead. So let's take a look at that. It says queen to e4 is an even better move, which that threatens a mate. So queen to e4 threatens a mate in 1 here. Then it looks like f5 would have to be played. Then the g pawn could capture. But Magnus, keeps things simple. He's just going to go ahead in material, grabbing this rook. Now there's a threat of a mate here. So Magnus just moves his bishop, developing, and the rook is covering that mate threat. So now we have this capture, but that leads to this. So Magnus is ahead by +3, and here his opponent resigned because, what do? He's forced to capture, and then Magnus, sacrificed that rook, and he'll trade down material with the fork here. So right now, black is ahead by +1, but once the king moves, now the queen is snatched up here, and then let's see, it's +8. After this capture, it's still +5. So Magnus just trading down material. So when you're ahead, just trade down material, and then the game could go on like this, attacking, trying to trade down more material. We have an attack on this pawn, but now an attack on the bishop. So, if the game were to continue, what does this bishop do? The bishop has to run or retreat. Black is just running out of options, and Magnus will just continue to trade down material into an even more winning endgame. All right, so I went over this game more than once. I'll do a quick review of the 15 chess tips that we covered today, just so you can remember. The first one was stay with one opening for a while before you decide to change up to another opening, because it takes a while to play an opening regularly to learn all the ins and outs of that opening, learn where the pieces belong in that opening and into the middle game, to see what the different pawn structures are. And so, just figure out what your opening move should be, and then start working one move at a time on what response you will play, depending on how your opponent responds. So, stick with an opening for a while at least before you decide to change to another one, because if you switch openings too often, let's say one person spends a year on one opening and another person changes every 3 months to 4 different openings. Well, you might have a little bit of knowledge in 4 different openings, but the person who sticks with that one opening will have a much deeper amount of knowledge in that opening that they've been playing for a whole year. And, they'll know a lot more about that opening and how to play it, and they'll probably end up winning more with that opening than somebody who just has a superficial knowledge or a light amount of knowledge on 4 different openings. Plus, if you play too many different openings, you could confuse the different moves of those openings. Unless you have a really good memory, then you may be able to get away with playing different openings. All right. Number 2 was avoid trades that help the opponent develop. So, you don't want to move a knight up somewhere have an opponent that moves a knight out, and then you capture with your bishop, giving up your bishop that has developed, and helping the queen develop by recapturing. That's just one example. But just watch out. Avoid trades that help the opponent develop. Also, avoid pins, because pins can be very dangerous, so it's usually a good idea to break those pins quickly and avoid pins. And also pin your opponent if you can. Number 4, learn the value of pawn structure. So you don't want to make your pawns weak by having too many doubled pawns, backward pawns. So here you have to watch out when you push a pawn too far, it can leave weaknesses behind. So now this A pawn can no longer protect B3 or B4. So, just keep that in mind when you go thinking about pushing pawns all over the board. Okay, number Let's see. Okay, Number one was stay with one opening for a long time. Number two was avoid trades that help the opponent develop. Number three was avoid pins. Um, Number four was learn the value of pawn structures. And number five is don't trade your good pieces for your opponent's bad pieces. So, if your opponent has a bad bishop trapped in behind its own pawns, and you have a knight on a good outpost, in the middle of the board, you might want to think twice before you just give up that great knight for a bishop, even though it might give you the bishop pair. But maybe that bishop wasn't doing anything anyway because the pawns trapped it in, and then you give up your great knight for that mediocre bishop. So just remember, don't trade your good pieces for your opponent's bad ones. All right. Let's see here. Number 6. Watch out for forks. So, mostly the knights, can cause people trouble with forks. But, any piece can fork pretty much. Even the king and the pawns can fork pieces. So watch out for surprising fork possibilities. Okay, number 7. Pawn moves create weaknesses, as I mentioned here. So, avoid pawn moves that create too many weaknesses. Like, here, Magnus is gaining space by pushing this pawn. But just remember, if this c pawn pushed here, then the only way to cover b4 and b3 is with your pieces. So it becomes harder to cover things, cover squares when only the pieces can cover them, especially in the end game when all the pieces start trading off. Okay, number 8. Watch out for discovered attacks. As we saw in this game, when there was a discovered attack, let's see here. And in this position where the discovered attack of the knight moving over, checking the king, and the queen has a discovered attack on the knight. So watch out for discovered attacks, especially when the king is involved. All right, number 9 was keep an eye on knight moves. As we saw, these dangerous knight moves jumping here and causing problems, winning the game for Magnus. And now anchor bishops to pawns. So if we go back here, there was at least one example of a bishop being anchored to a pawn early in the game here. Let's see, maybe at the very beginning. So here, this bishop is anchored to the pawn on a4. So they protect each other. And now, the only way to get rid of this bishop is to chase it away with the pawn, or to just try and attack it with a piece and capture it, but then the pawn could recapture. So when you anchor a bishop to a pawn, they do a good job of protecting each other. And that can definitely come in handy in the end game. All right, let's see. Number 11, don't give away pawns. So just remember, don't just go around giving away all your pawns unless you have a good follow-up plan, because each pawn could potentially promote to a queen. Number 12, use pawn breaks. So just remember that if you keep an eye out for good opportunities to push your pawns at the right moment. So here, see the computer right there recommended that this pawn push forward with an attack. So eventually these pawns are going to move on the king side here. So here, this pawn pushed forward, but the pawn cannot continue to move forward as a lot of pieces are covering this d4 square. Finally, we have this g4 pawn, breaking forward, jumping in here, attacking, and it's going to help bolster an h5 pawn break. So the knight retreats, and we have the h5 pawn break, pushing forward, beginning a pawn storm and an attack on the king side there. So capture, and Magnus ignores that and dives in with his attack. So remember, pushing pawns at the right moment to open up lines of attack can be used to great advantage. Just keep an eye out for those. Number 13, use backward piece moves. So sometimes it pays to move backwards. You know, most of the time you're always pushing your pieces forward, attacking, but once in a while you might have to retreat your pieces to reposition them to an even better square. So keep that in mind. Number 14, use outposts. So anytime you can position a piece, especially if it's in your opponent's territory and where it's protected. Now, here we have, you know, kind of an outpost. The knight is up here on g5 and it's protected, but the pawns can chase that knight away. And, you know, we kind of saw that earlier in the game here, where this knight had a great outpost here, even earlier. So here, no pawn can chase this knight away. It's protected by a pawn, and it's on this d4 outpost. So Magnus wants to get rid of that knight. So first he jumps this knight out of the way, and then the pawn will be able to chase that knight out of there. So he chases the knight away from that nice outpost, and it has to retreat. So use outposts and try to prevent your opponent from putting their pieces on outposts. Number 15, which is number 45 in this 3-video series, and you can check out the other 30 chess tips on how to improve your chess in the previous 2 videos. So the final one here is, when you're up a lot of material, sacrifice into a winning endgame, you know, to make the win easier. So we saw Magnus do that. You know, he starts attacking, and now the pieces are being traded off. So at this point, it's even. His opponent tries to get an attack going here on the king side, but has overlooked the possibility of, you know, this rook being captured. So now the the rook here on h1 moves up to h3, chasing the queen, and the queen moves here. You know, what else could the queen have done? Because now we have this capture of the rook. So Magnus is ahead by +4 at this point. And so now there's a mate threat and some more trades. But this sacrifice of the rook here allows the knight to fork and trade off more material. So an example of when you're up a lot of material, you know, so once Magnus was up that rook, he sacrificed his rook to allow that combination to trade off even more material here. You know, but his opponent resigned before playing the rest of that out. All right, well, I hope that these tips will help you improve your chess, and feel free to leave comments on any tips that I may have missed, any tips that have really helped you improve your chess over time. You know, just leave a comment and let the rest of us know what chess tips have really helped you improve. Okay, well, if you haven't already, please like and subscribe to support this channel. Feel free to leave comments and suggestions, as I mentioned. And also, if there's any requests for some chess material you would really like to see in future videos, leave a comment with that as well. And so I thank you for watching, and have a super chess day.